issues of water, land use, climate, housing, transportation, energy, civil rights, and environmental justice. The organization is headquartered in Fresno with offices in Kern County, Riverside County, and the state capital. And Phoebe is based in Sacramento and oversees the state policy portfolio and legal advocacy. She received her BA in history from UC Berkeley and her JD from UCLA. I want to welcome to the stage, thank you so much for bringing the California perspective to our conversation tonight.
And what, is this the mic?
I think you're wearing your bag.
Oh, I'm wearing a mic.
Yes. Can everybody hear her?
Say something. Hello, good evening.
Good evening. Yeah. Yeah.
Working up here, this one? Okay. This work?
Thank you so much for the invitation and for being here at 6 o'clock. Look forward to having a bit of time for conversation and questions. I think I would have loved Mona to be able to stay on. One of the questions that comes up a lot for us, we work on a wide variety of issues. Again, we're an social justice advocacy organization, a lot of work around environmental justice, neighborhood health, writ large, drinking water, housing, and climate justice, air quality. We have a team of about 25 people, and we work with about 1,000 residents. And if anybody can make a colorable argument that something is related to the environment or neighborhood health and well-being, we're like, yeah, we'll work on that. So our portfolio is getting bigger and bigger, but one of the foundational pieces has always been safe drinking water. And one of the even more foundational pieces is a civil rights scope and environmental justice scope, and ensuring that the communities most impacted by environmental justice and political exclusion are at the forefront. And one of the conversations and debates and fights and throwdowns that we've had internally in California for several years now is when we're doing our publicity about water, is it appropriate to say Flint is happening in California? And it's just to throw it out there, it seems, well, obvious, let's bring attention and make sure that we're demonstrating that this isn't just a Flint issue or just a California issue. But the counter is, well, let's not exploit what happened in Flint for the advocacy that needs to happen in California. And it's just a really, I think, a good way to raise this conversation is to what extent are people that are most impacted or the real leaders leading the conversation, and to what extent are we letting ourselves, some of the advocates, take on and exploit the experience of others. With that. A little bit about California. Who's a Californian in here? A lot of Californians. Who's spent time in the San Joaquin Valley? Good amount of folks. How about the Coachella Valley? Not that many. When you hear Coachella, do you think, is the first thought that comes to mind a music festival? Disadvantaged unincorporated communities in California. This is a focus on the San Joaquin Valley, a study that we participated in, where identified all of the communities in the San Joaquin Valley that are unincorporated, so not in cities, and lower income. This is important in the area of safe drinking water. The vast majority of Californians without safe drinking water are in unincorporated communities. The next map you'll see looks a little bit, looks similar. And this is the map, the red stars are public water systems in California that have water that doesn't comply with legal standards and doesn't comply, the majority of contaminated drinking water from public water systems is nitrates, arsenic, hexavalent chromium, which is the Aaron Brockovich chemical, TCP123, which is a byproduct of actually dumping from Dow and Shell many years ago. And this does not even include lead. So this doesn't include the vast majority of lead contamination, which is in the fixtures and the pipes in facilities. It also doesn't include the 2 million Californians that are reliant on very, very small water systems or domestic wells, often the most vulnerable. Many Californians, in the Coachella Valley is really where we see this, where there's tens of thousands of people living in mobile home parks, very small communities reliant on their own public water system or their own water system that's run by the mobile home park, and we don't even necessarily have data on those. So this is a pretty appalling figure of the kind of widespread, the prevalence of unsafe drinking water in California, and it doesn't even include some of the most vulnerable folks in California. And you'll see that there's a bit of a concentration, where in inland California, the San Joaquin Valley, the Salinas Valley, and the south central area is a lot of unsafe drinking water. And not to give away a punchline later on, but does anybody, what happens in those areas that might have an impact on drinking water quality?
Agriculture.
Yeah, farming. So agriculture is a big culprit. And I was telling Professor earlier today that I'm a little bit frazzled, just came out of a very tense meeting with ag on groundwater quality and groundwater quality protection or lack thereof. So it's definitely front of my mind right now. So how did we get here? Mona spoke a lot about this. We didn't wake up in 2019 with unsafe drinking water in California, randomly dispersed throughout the state. It's very much a part of our kind of patterns and practice of how we've developed and how we've invested in California, and as a country and as localities, et cetera. We have exclusion from services. So we'll talk about this a little bit, but we have cities that have literally grown around small communities that they didn't want to include in their service provision. Inadequate funding, so lack of amount of funding and type of funding that is usable and accessible to especially lower income communities and communities of color. Contaminated drinking water sources and supplies. So somebody in the back asked us about Flint, the river. So not only do we have, one of the reasons we have unsafe water coming out of the tap is we have unsafe water coming from sources. In California, another important note is the Clean Water Act addresses surface water, lakes and rivers. There is not an analog for groundwater. Much of California is reliant on groundwater. There's California law called Port of Cologne, which regulates groundwater to varying degrees of success. But a lot of Californians, especially those reliant on groundwater, are very, very vulnerable to contaminated drinking water sources. And two of the big culprits are discharges from ag, and then septic systems or failing wastewater systems generally. Drought was a huge crisis for the most vulnerable Californians. People just totally lost complete supply of their water. They'd turn on the tap and water wouldn't come out. And then we also have overpumping of aquifers. Again, not to put too much blame on the agricultural community, but the agricultural, I don't know, There Will Be Blood, did people see There Will Be Blood, where basically whoever has a bigger straw can go deeper into the aquifer, and it's usually bigger industries that can go deeper into the aquifer. So just a little bit more detail. I want to talk a little bit about exclusion from services, which is my passion, not excluding people from services, but trying to address it. This is a community called Matheny Tract, California. The orange, outlined in orange, is the community of Matheny Tract. The purple, if you can see, is the city of Tulare. And many years ago, the city of Tulare wanted to annex the yellow triangle. The community of Matheny Tract didn't have had unsafe drinking water, contaminated with arsenic, and did not have access to wastewater services. They were like perfectly placed downwind from the city's wastewater service treatment facility, but didn't actually have access to the wastewater service themselves. As a result of kind of litigation and state policy and a lot of work, mostly community organizing, the community negotiated that the city would have to connect to the community if the city was going to annex that land. And what I should have said is, if there was a zoomed out picture, you could see that The city was, of course, going to extend its services throughout that yellow triangle for industrial uses, not to the community. And the purple area, there were services completely surrounding the community for a lot of industrial development that had happened to the east and the west. Community is historically African American and Caucasian, with a canal separating the two communities. It's now almost exclusively African American and Latino. There was amazing things were said in meetings in terms of what, if Matheny track mothers love their kids, then move, and they wouldn't send you to complain to me. Stuff along those lines. So there's still a lot of antagonism between the powers that be and communities that have the audacity to ask for safe drinking water. Similar, this is Toledo. Toledo is also in Tulare, within tracks Tulare County, Tooleville, Tulare County. What you can't quite see is this is Tooleville, not a lot of infrastructure. The water has very high levels of nitrate. It doesn't exceed the legal standard right now. And there is chrome 6 in the water, in addition to some other contaminants. They're very close to a community called Exeter. And also they're just at the end of the community is a fence and then a canal that brings water to agriculture throughout the valley. But of course, the community doesn't have access to that irrigation water. Many communities who are near irrigation canals can't access irrigation water, but they are charged fees for having the right to be close to the irrigation canal. Which is an issue that we've just, not so much a drinking water issue, but an issue that we've also started to take on. Costs. Lanier became the poster child for unsafe drinking water for many, many years. Lanier is in Fresno County. Lanier had arsenic, very, very high levels of arsenic in its water, and received a grant, capital, to build this arsenic treatment facility. Lanier also, I should say, historically an African-American community, moved from farm labor camps to develop a community, built a water system. Years later, it tested high for arsenic. They were able to bring it, became increasingly like many communities in the San Joaquin Valley. It's now African American and Latino. Built the arsenic treatment facility. The engineering firm didn't really do an analysis of what it would cost to run the facility. In order to run the facility and buy the chemicals to maintain the facility, water rates were going to go from $25 a month for a very low income community to $138 a month. Nobody could pay, and after 6 months, the arsenic treatment plant stopped operating, and people for the next decade had arsenic in their water again. And about $100,000 of debt from the operations of the facility that they weren't able to support. Talked a little bit about this, some of the issues around contamination. We see some very, very high levels of nitrate, especially contamination near dairy farms and near irrigated agriculture. And then here's another, this is a picture from Coachella Valley, where many people are, throughout the state, are reliant on septic systems on very small lots. And a septic system on a very small lot is often not adequate to filter wastewater. And it can contaminate both nearby soils and groundwater supplies. We also see often very rudimentary waste treatment and disposal facilities. This is a hose running between houses into a cesspool. This is actually changing gears a little bit. The use of water and pumping of water, and how the over-pumping of aquifers and the long-term preference in policy and practice for irrigated agriculture really takes a toll on aquifers. So what we see, especially in the San Joaquin Valley, is land subsidence and depletion of water. This is for corn silage, likely for feed. So we're beginning to turn the corner. I think the title was "We've come so far, we have so far to go." So in the "We've come so far," we hope, the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. Has anybody by chance heard about the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund? So this was like a monumental, in the midst of it, it was a monumental set of conference calls every week. But it was a monumental effort with about 140 organizations, 100 environmental justice, drinking water, public health organizations that came together throughout the state to say we have a huge gap in funding available for drinking water. And Lanier came up many times, and other communities came up many times. And the real crux of the issue that the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund is meant to solve is that in especially small communities and lower income communities, there is no way to treat. We could build the best treatment plant possible, but for the energy necessary and the chemicals necessary and the operations necessary to treat it, you need money to support operations and maintenance. And there wasn't funding. There was funding available for capital improvements, for actually building the pipes and the structures, not enough, but some, and no money for operations and maintenance, and no sustainable source of funding for when people had emergencies and needed bottled water or needed a new well dug or something along those lines. So this was an effort that took place formally over the course of 3 years, and it was 3 years of talking to legislators, 3 years of trying to get the governor on board, 3 years of media, 3 years of more media, 3 years of community members from the Coachella Valley to Kern, from the Salinas Valley, and this area, waking up at 4 in the morning to lobby their legislators and saying, this is not that much money, this is safe drinking water, we're the 5th largest economy in the world, people should not have to be concerned about giving their kids unsafe drinking water or themselves drinking unsafe drinking water, and this is ridiculous. For this year, Governor Newsom came out of the gate right away. One of his first days in office, he traveled to the San Joaquin Valley to highlight the issue of unsafe drinking water with his cabinet and really signaled that this is the year that we're going to get this done, and we'll talk about it in a second. Consolidation authorities, again, we'll talk about this. This really points to the issue around the exclusion that we discussed earlier, where you have these, many communities surrounding cities and large water districts that are not connected and are reliant on not just unsafe drinking water, but unreliable water supplies. And then sustainable groundwater management. Several years ago, during the drought, people were running out of water. There was massive subsidence. Legislature and many stakeholders got together and said, we have to do something. We're one of the few states that doesn't regulate groundwater in terms of quantity at all. And we're going to create a kind of a hybrid approach between local control and the state control, whereby we're actually going to do something about our groundwater. So, I talked about this a lot. This is one kind of small group of folks who came to, there's a gentleman in the front named Juventino, who's been like the lead client in 3 cases on safe drinking water. So we kind of had this joke of Juventino Gonzalez versus like question mark, like who's next? But this is kind of a group of folks who came to lobby on safe and affordable drinking water. And this was, again, after 3 years, signed into law in a very, very small community called Tombstone Territory about a month ago. So for the first time, there's funding allocated for at least the next 10 years in California, where the state will set aside $130 million to address unsafe drinking water in the state. Huge gap, and it's really, really going to be kind of instrumental in making sure some of the smaller systems can either get access to a reliable drinking water supply, or they themselves pay for safe drinking water. Consolidation authorities. Where to begin? Matheny Tract is a good place to begin. So Matheny Tract became, again, the poster child for this is what our development practices and patterns and growth has looked like over the past century. We've kind of tacitly condoned, generally speaking, majority white cities to exclude communities of color from not just decision-making, which is bad enough, but also basic services, water and wastewater. This grew and grew and grew and grew in terms of raising awareness of this issue. Some of the mapping that we have really shows this, not just the city of Tulare, but city of Fresno, city of Modesto, growing to the north and west. In terms of residential development, where in communities of color lived in the southeast historically, and so the city would grow through industrial development, continue to grow to the south and east, residential development to the north and west, and continue to exclude some of the communities nearby from water and wastewater service. That awareness around that began to grow, and embarrassment around that began to grow at the same time as the height of the drought several years ago. There's a community called East Porterville, just outside the city of Porterville, also Tulare County, that started running out of water, but many households were running out of water because of the drought. So we launched an effort at that time on a bill called SB 88. It was a 1 month process. So it was, they say, like, if you don't watch laws and sausages being made, it was a 1 month process to develop this legislation and try to keep the cities who hated this and the water agencies from totally opposing and going nuclear. And what the law said was that the state water board, the state, in circumstances where a community doesn't have safe, reliable drinking water, and a city nearby is not willing to provide that community with safe drinking water, the state can mandate the city to extend its water service to the community. The first community that was subject to that process was Matheny Tract. We talked about a little bit earlier, and the picture to your left, my right, is René Palmas turning on the valve in Matheny Tract and turning on safe drinking water when they connected with the city of Tulare a couple years ago. On the right is Jovita in Tombstone territory. She's smiling, but that is super contaminated water. Nitrates and TCP. That community is very close to the community of Sanger in Fresno County. And we've been working on a negotiation with Sanger, with kind of Jovita at the forefront, to make sure that Sanger connects to Tombstone territory. Not only is their water extraordinarily contaminated, it is also many of the wells in Tombstone ran dry during the drought, and one more ran dry several months ago. So it's an ongoing crisis. We don't believe that the state will have to use its mandatory authorities through kind of a series of negotiations. It looks like the city will agree to connect, but having that threat, for lack of a better word, available is extraordinarily helpful. As I mentioned earlier, Matheny Tract and the vast majority of communities like Matheny Tract that have been excluded from drinking water service have also been excluded from wastewater service. So the vast majority of communities, especially disadvantaged lower income communities in the San Joaquin Valley, Coachella Valley, and even Salinas Valley, that don't have access to wastewater service, don't have requisite land to support a septic system. And certainly don't have sufficient land to support any kind of rudimentary cesspool, which is really never safe. So a couple of years ago, we said SB 88 was fun. It was fun to irritate everybody. Let's see if we can create similar authorities in the world of wastewater, whereby the state has the authority to identify communities that don't have adequate wastewater service and require cities who have long excluded those communities, require those cities to extend wastewater service to the community. That bill was SB 1215, and it will, July 1st was the beginning of implementation of that bill. So we're really waiting to see how far we can take that. Again, the feeding tract is probably going to be the first place where we work on that issue of requiring extension of wastewater service. And again, there's of course that connection, not just from a civil rights perspective, not just from a human rights perspective, as if that's not enough, but the connection with wastewater service and drinking water supplies. Groundwater management. Groundwater management, this is another kind of like, this is more a solutions in sight with a question mark at the end. So there's kind of an understanding that we need to do a better job in California of addressing our groundwater, protecting our groundwater supplies, and making sure that everybody has access to this precious resource. We are kind of right in the midst of seeing if this California's experiment with required groundwater management is going to work. Unfortunately, what we've seen so far is that there still isn't a lot of attention paid to drinking water quality. So one of the issues that the groundwater management programs are supposed to look at is water quality. And so far, several of them have said, well, if people run out of drinking water or if drinking water isn't good, we'll buy bottled water. But we don't actually have to protect drinking water or groundwater from contamination. That's not really our job. So a lot of people, a lot of community members are mobilizing to make sure that when we're looking at groundwater management, we're looking at quality and supply for people, and not just rice and corn and grapes. I wanted to start with and end with, but the community engagement has just been critical. We've heard about it in the last presentation as well. There's very little that we can do as advocates without taking direction from community members who are confronting issues from the local level to the regional level to the statewide level. And there's been, on the issue of water in particular, just a groundswell of activity and engagement, which has really brought the issue to the fore and turned the corner on our extraordinarily inadequate attention as a state to drinking water quality. So on the left, this is folks working on sustainable groundwater management. The picture on the right is the mandatory consolidation, where community members are convincing the state board to follow through with their order. And on the bottom right is folks who litigated and took on the city of Tulare on their failure to comply with their commitment. And the two issues that I think we're still really feel behind on are groundwater quality. So I mentioned that came out of a meeting today on groundwater quality, and it just does not feel like the urgency is there. There's now, well, maybe we could just find alternative water supplies, but in 50 years, who are going to be the communities most impacted by the contamination that we do today? We all know the answer to that question. And the other issue that's really still outstanding is affordability. That there's a lot of folks can't afford drinking water. They're still choosing between paying for medicine and paying their drinking water bill. In many communities throughout the state, we still have a lot of lead in facilities, especially everywhere, but in a lot of urban areas, LA, Oakland are two that come to mind. And I think that those are going to be the next battles that we see. One on the side of keeping contaminants and contaminators accountable, and addressing the affordability issue, so that the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund and our fight for safe and affordable drinking water really is true to both of those super important adjectives. And I think that's it.
annexation. See one way in the back and one in the front. Do the front, we'll make our way back there.
You talked about the unincorporated regions and how they ask for neighboring cities to extend the services of water, and you were mentioning also pushing for wastewater. Have you, besides just extending the services, is there a possibility to incorporate these regions to the city, or is that more difficult battle?
That's a great question. I'll try to be brief. The question, did everybody hear it? Yeah. So the question is, we talked a lot about extending services, water, wastewater. What about just incorporating and annexing communities that have long been excluded from cities so that they're part of government and vote for their representatives? When I started this work, that was actually a big part of our work, was fighting for annexation. The complication is that it depends on the community. Many communities are very much supportive of annexation, want to be part of cities. Some are, they never wanted us before, now I don't want to be part of them. And some folks are very concerned about both in literal terms and in kind of figurative terms of a big part of the city. So one is, I like being in an unincorporated community, I just like how it feels. And then on the other end of the spectrum is, if we get annexed in, I won't be able to, I'm a trucker, I won't be able to, the municipal code doesn't allow truck parking in residential neighborhoods. Or I have a horse on my property, the municipal code doesn't allow. So there's been, often a community is split. They're very kind of uniform in desire for public services and split on annexation. So it's usually a longer campaign and a longer conversation. The other issue is, kind of as an aside, is one of the things that we often work on is looking at zoning and really technically overlay zones. So often a wealthier community generally can negotiate to be part of the city but not be subject to certain ordinances, whereas lower income communities often have less access and less negotiating power. And so one of the things that we've worked on is creating overlay zones. So the Tombstone, Covita, what we've been negotiating currently is that if the community is annexed in, the residents can still maintain their wells that they use for irrigating their backyards. That was a really long answer to your question, but it was a really good question.
I'm gonna go try to catch that hand that was in the back. Where was it?
Thank you for the presentation. You talked about contaminants in agriculture. How about if you go in the Bay Area, and I'm talking about refineries? Does it pose a problem to close communities like in Richmond or in Martinez about the drinking water? That's my question.
It's a good question. We haven't seen as much in the drinking water supplies, and that's in large part because of sophisticated treatment facilities. There's still a good deal of perchlorate from airplane fuels, and then there's a lot of surface water and kind of environmental contamination from the refineries. There's more and more discussion about fracking and oil production and what that does. And there's been also huge waivers on the oil and gas side. So unfortunately, I think we don't know the depth, no pun intended, of some of the impacts, but we haven't seen kind of coming from the tap unsafe drinking water in the Richmond area.
Other questions? get to. Where was it?
So in these municipalities where they're building new systems and stuff, with knowing where we've stood in the past with the drought and things like that, is there an increased effort in water reclamation, like catching the wastewater that can be used and for other purposes that you don't necessarily need the clean water for?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. One is there's a way more infrastructure and effort and investment in treatment so that wastewater is actually safe for drinking. It's a full cycle. It's useful for many sources. The other kind of interesting point is I think that somebody we work with at the state board does have this vision of having parallel systems. So you have one system with potable drinking water and another system with not potable water that you can use for irrigation. I think there's risks involved because water comes into contact with people and pets, but that is definitely something that's been on the table. And there's much more work around reclamation and recharge. So recharging also the groundwater. How can we better use the water that we have and recharge our aquifers and maintain our stream flows, so our streams, instead of in addition to treating water for reuse.
Sure, thank you. You mentioned that agriculture is a major risk to water quality in San Joaquin. I'm interested in fracking as well. Is this reared its head, so to speak? Is that gathering momentum and interest?
Yeah, fracking is. I think there's been more and more interest around fracking and more and more oversight. And I think unfortunately the fracking has gotten a pass for a while. Got a pass for a while. And now there's more oversight, regulation, and then, not to get too political, but this administration locally, or state administration, is more interested in looking at the impacts of oil and fracking and production on water and on the environment generally.
I'm not sure if it's faster to pass it down the row or to hustle to the other side of the auditorium.
Hi, thanks for being here today. Really appreciate your presentation. I was just curious, you mentioned some of these barriers that we have to clean drinking tap water, like the big agriculture and the high cost of the treatment facilities. I'm just curious about bottled water. How does that fit into this conversation? Could you comment on that?
So, sure, I think bottled water is right now, a couple things. Bottled water is used as an interim solution. So for example, several of the communities I mentioned today, so the communities people work in that are working towards a longer term solution, either a new treatment facility or connecting to a nearby water system, receive actually state subsidized 5-gallon jugs of water. Another interim solution is the kiosks, the kiosks that you go to, or that one goes to fill those 5-gallon jugs. Several communities have those, have kiosks as well. Some of the issues around bottled water is with any service, with any door-to-door service, there's often interruptions, or I can't think of a community offhand where there hasn't been an interruption. So there's still some kinks in terms of making it a well-oiled machine. And then there's also on the kiosk issue, and even on the delivery of bottled water issue, mobility issues. So folks with mobility issues have a really hard time lifting bottles or going to kiosks. So it's really, I think, an extremely important short-term solution. Stopgap was what I was looking for. But can't replace having clean water coming from the tap.
We have the last few questions to round up our evening. Wait for the mic.
I don't know if I need that even.
I think for our audio recording, we need to get you on the mic, that's the thing. Sorry. There you go.
So this has been bothering me for a year or two. I don't know who in here has seen the movie The Big Short, but it was about the housing crisis, and this one gentleman seen it coming and kind of did a lot of investing around it. And at the end of the movie, it was talking about all of his investments now after he's gotten out of housing have all been investing in water. And we see water shortages in India this year. There's been a huge crisis over there and stuff. And I'm just curious how is he investing in water, and where's the money in it? So if you have somebody like a big organization who's looking at finance and thinks that the next big market to get into is water, can you explain that to me?
Yeah, I mean, sure, water is really, can be commodified even as water per se. So what we see in California is water sold to transfers who sold it for development, for real estate development in places that have less water, or even transfer to other agricultural users, or then water can also be extremely valuable for hydroelectric, the use of water for energy production. Where I'm most familiar with is California, where we do see a significant amount of water transfer and development of water markets. The countervailing kind of public policy and legal structure is water as a public trust. So who owns the water? You know, the way that California law is set up is it's kind of first in time, first in right for many years, and then there was a more kind of regulatory approaches on the groundwater side. You own the water under your ground, under your land, and so that, as I talked a little bit earlier, the quicker that you can produce, the more that you can lay claim to the water. It's your water to commodify and transfer. It's extraordinarily. There's been really, I think some of the most accessible writing, especially on the relationship between ag and water as a commodity, has been. Mark Arax has touched on it a bit in a lot of his writing. I haven't yet read, but there's a new book called Dreamt Land. One of the kind of the characters in California water is the Resnick Palm Halos, wonderful ranch, where they where a lot of their value is in water. So they own a controlling share, I think 49% of the current water bank. So not only is there production in ag production, but there kind of a lot of the brilliance was in the resource that was under their land and commodifying that. Basically, to not necessarily, it's again my bias, highest and best use, but most profitable use. So that's, I mean, it has been unfortunately too easy to commodify. There's been more and more case law and more policy work around trying to reestablish water as a public trust and water as the shared ownership around water, but there's a lot more needs to be done on that.
Well, I want to thank Phoebe for being here, and thank your organization and you for all of the great work that you've done. Can you all welcome, thank her again.